Hey there, this is Dane from featherprop.com. Thanks for tuning in with me here today. It seems that the Shroud of Turin has been in the news a lot lately, making its rounds once again. So I thought I'd do this video to talk about it a little bit and discuss the impact of it on Christianity. Now, if you're not familiar with the Shroud of Turin, let me give you some background. The shroud is a piece of linen measuring just under 15 feet long and a bit over 3 feet wide. It appeared first in recorded documents around the year 1354. It was moved to a number of different locations, damaged by fire in 1532, and eventually made its way to Turin, which is a city in northern Italy. The Shroud of Turin is now owned by the Roman Catholic Church. In 1898, an Italian photographer, Pia, took photos of the shroud and discovered that the negatives of those photos produced an image on the cloth that had not been clearly observed before. It's as if the linen cloth is a negative itself, and therefore a negative photo of a negative photo somehow produced a positive image. This positive image appears to show the figure of a naked man. He appears to be deceased with his hands crossed in front of him and one leg slightly bent, as if in rigor mortis. Upon closer inspection, this naked man appears to have wounds on his hands and his feet, on the crown of his head, and on his right side. Now, these wounds are consistent with the injuries that we know Jesus would have received during his crucifixion. The shroud is held by many to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, in 1969, 1973, and 1978, the church allowed the cloth to be examined by scientists and scholars. Those examinations were not completely conclusive, but it appeared at least that the cloth had not been faked. Then in 1988, radiocarbon dating of the shroud took place. These results suggested that the shroud originated sometime around 1260 to 1390 AD, which is close to the time when it was introduced into the historical record. Now, I recall hearing that information way back in the early 90s, and as a result, I kind of lost interest in the whole thing. Recently, however, there has been a surge of news articles that have raised some doubts regarding the dating of the cloth and the accuracy of the radiocarbon dating that had been done. Now, I'm not a scientist, and so I'm not in a position to comment on radiocarbon dating and things like that. I do know that there are many who challenge its accuracy, while some are quite confident with it. In any event, recent tests using more modern technology have suggested that the shroud is most likely dated to the 1st century AD. Now, if this is correct, then the dating obstacle that had been in place for the past several decades has been removed, and we may once again be in a position to consider the shroud on its other merits. Now, I believe that one of the shroud's most convincing proofs is that scientists don't know how the image became burned, for a lack of a better word, into the cloth. Historians have confirmed that we have hundreds of burial cloths from that era, yet not a single one of them has an image embedded into it. So how could this single piece of linen have an image pressed into it, as it were, in a manner that no one can figure out how it was done? Even if the image and cloth came from the 14th century, our scientists seem to be at a loss to understand the technology employed by its creator to make it. Now, the purpose of this video is not to make a case for or against the Shroud of Turin. As I said, I'm not a scientist and I'm not studied enough to discuss the arguments surrounding it. Rather, what I want to do is talk about its impact. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the shroud is one day demonstrated to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus. And our scientists believe that the image was burned into the cloth by some radiation or light coming from the body, i.e. the resurrection. What would that mean to us? Of course, this would have to suggest that the resurrection was an historical fact. However, I believe that an honest examination of the evidence that we already have would lead us to that very same conclusion. And remember that Jesus pointed out in Luke 16 that even if someone rises from the dead, there will be those who simply will not believe. But beyond that, if the shroud were to be confirmed as Jesus' actual burial cloth, I suspect that we may soon have trouble heading our way. Christianity, as I understand and live it, is a system of faith, not dependent upon tangible items or locations. A person can closely follow and love Jesus while making a pilgrimage to any holy land or a temple anywhere. We don't need holy instruments. We don't have holy vessels that must be used or vestments that have to be worn. Christians aren't required to face certain directions while praying or get into certain positions or even required to pray at predetermined times. We don't have to worship in special locations or during specific events. We don't have required feasts or festivals, and we aren't required to eat or avoid eating certain foods. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't have or use tangible things as part of our worship. We can use things like robes and altar rails, cups, art, instruments, and things like that if we like. Rather, what it does mean is that God has made the way to Him as easy and simple as possible. There's also another reason, I suspect, why God has removed required instruments or items or holy things from our worship. And that's because we may have a tendency to revere, honor, or even worship them. We may even hide behind them a little, thinking that we're offering God something great, and what He really wants is our devotion. A good example of this is how God gave Israel the Sabbath as a way to honor Him. By the time Jesus came on the scene, Sabbath keeping had taken a life all of its own, and it wasn't a good one. What was meant to be good and holy became abused by the people because, frankly, that's what we do. Now, someone might object and say, hey, don't we have baptism and communion? Don't these contain tangible items or elements that God gave us? Well, yes, we do. We have baptism and communion, and these activities contain elements that we use in our worship. But if we look closely at this subject, I think we might find that these elements are not of great import. Regarding baptism, remember that Jesus de-emphasized water in Acts 1:5. He said that John the Baptist did it in water, but that his baptism would be done in the Spirit. As a result, we have no mandate regarding the amount of water to be used, temperature of that water, its source, such as from a lake, river, or stream, and there's no command regarding the exact manner of how we are to baptize. This tells me that there's very little emphasis to be placed on the element of water and the method that we use in baptism. And in respect to the elements of communion, the cup and the bread, we have no instructions on what specific types we're to use or how to prepare the elements, their ingredients, the amounts to be used, or if they have to be in some way consecrated first. Furthermore, Jesus never actually commanded us to even participate in communion. Paul only wrote that as often as we do it, we proclaim the death of Jesus. That statement gives us no schedule to follow. This tells me that just like baptism, the emphasis of these worship aids needs to remain on the heart of the participant, not the actual consuming or the use of the elements. You see, Christianity can be participated in without having something to touch or handle, taste, or visit. This is what makes it easy to introduce Jesus to various cultures and people, because there are no demands placed on them to produce certain pots, pans, robes, or furniture. Therefore, as I see it, if we suddenly had something tangible, like the Shroud of Turin, I suspect that within a very short time, the shroud would be venerated and worshipped. Pilgrimages would be made to see it. People would probably claim to have been healed just by looking at it. It would no longer point to the author of our faith, but like the Sabbath-keeping laws of the Old Testament, it would likely take a very dark life of its own and become the very object of some people's faith. Yes, it may be a relic that we could refer to in order to demonstrate the validity of our faith, but I suspect the damage it would do could far outweigh the good that it would bring. So, do I think the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial cloth of Jesus? I have no idea. I have to admit that some of the evidence is in favor of it is pretty convincing, and there's something about it that really appeals to me. But in some other ways, I actually hope it's not. We've gotten along pretty good these past few decades thinking that it's not connected to Jesus, and I'm sure the church will be just fine without it. Well, why don't you leave your comments below? I'm really interested in knowing what you think about the shroud. Is it real? Is it fake? How would it affect your faith if it were proven to be genuine? And with that, I'll sign out, and I hope to see you here next time.